Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. Last week, we crossed the point of no return. The sides began squaring off and everybody knew what came next. As we saw with the Wangunk people and their sachem Sequin, the war to come was not as simple as European against native or everyone against the Pequots or even old friends sticking with old friends. It would be far more complex. Every group would be reacting to what was in their own best interest. Now, if you'll recall, almost a year ago when we began the podcast, the goal was to work our way towards the Revolutionary War. And I said I had two goals that I was trying to achieve within that larger goal. 2 points to underscore from the arrival of the Europeans through the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. And those were, 1, to demonstrate the miracle that occurred when the 13 colonies managed to work together to win their independence, because they were very different and often at odds with each other. And 2, to work through the various native positions. They were not ignorant savages. They were not all of the same mind. Often they competed for the same things. The Europeans were as much their tools as they were to the Europeans. And by tool, I mean just that, tools. Items that one uses to get the job done. An object to be employed to achieve a specific task, like a screwdriver or a hammer. The means to an end, where the end justified the means. These people groups vied for power, money, prestige, and they all aligned themselves with the groups that would help them realize their own goals. Last week, as we ended, I made several statements about the various groups involved and invested in the exploitation of the Connecticut frontier. We closed in part with this, quote, "The English had been passive-aggressive. They had not actually gone on the offensive a whole lot. They just made demands and breathed threats. The Pequots had been terrorizing the countryside, especially around Saybrook, but had not really fully engaged. The truth is that just 5 days prior to Weathersfield, on April 18th, the Massachusetts Bay General Court met for, quote, the special occasion of prosecuting the war against the Pequots, end quote. Not long after the massacre, and as a direct response to it, on May 16th, the Connecticut General Assembly declared an offensive war against the Pequots. Although the colonies or regions came to the same conclusions, that does not mean there was harmony among the English. They each had different reasons for engagement. They had varying views on how an offensive war should be conducted, or why there had to be one at all. Plymouth and the city of Boston both dragged their feet getting into the war. Truth be told, Boston's contribution was minimalized due to infighting, and Plymouth missed the engagement altogether due to their irritation with how Massachusetts Bay had conducted itself. Now, they eventually committed troops, but not for the sake of Massachusetts Bay or the folks living in Connecticut. And it was at this time that Uncas, the rebel Mohegan sachem, made his move to side firmly and permanently with the English, to their benefit and his, end quote. Today, we'll work through each of these statements one by one and learn how all these various parties lined up against the Pequots came together. The Weathersfield Massacre got everyone's attention. The other settlements of Connecticut finally understood the concern that Lyon Gardner had expressed all winter. It does seem like a pretty common thing, doesn't it? People seem to downplay or to ignore danger that's not directly affecting them. But there was no downplaying or ignoring the danger now, because it was directly affecting everybody. The men of the river settlements would not hunt or fish. They would not work in the fields without armed guards. At night, the posted watchmen sounded the alert at every sound. Nobody was sleeping very well. But help was already on its way from multiple groups. John Underhill had already left Boston when the Narragansett sent word to Massachusetts Bay that it looked like the Pequots were getting ready for war. You remember, they had been having skirmishes all spring. The Pequots had sent their old men, women, and children away to an island. They immediately suspected that it was Block Island, so Massachusetts Bay sent Captain Daniel Patrick and 40 men to capture them. The Narragansetts added men and acted as guides for the English, just as their treaty had mandated. At this point, all of the English interests believed the Pequots had to be taught a lesson. Governor Vane and John Winthrop in Massachusetts Bay, Edward Winslow in Plymouth, Thomas Hooker in Connecticut. The overall mood can be summed up nicely from the words of Reverend John Higginson from Saybrook, when he wrote, quote, "The eyes of all the Indians of the country are upon the English. If some serious and very speedy course not be taken to tame the pride and take down the insolency of these now insulting Pequots, we are like to have all the Indians in the country about our ears." End quote. So again, 5 days before the Weathersfield attack, on April 18th, the Massachusetts Bay General Court met for the special occasion of prosecuting the war against the Pequots, and they conscripted 160 men. Now, if you remember, there was already a type of early warning system in New England in the event of trouble. There was also a quick response plan in place in every community. It was a similar system, a precursor to the alarm system that included Minutemen that would one day enable Paul Revere and his compatriots to sound the alarm of the advancing British toward Concord and Lexington. Every house was required by law to have powder and lead. Each town conducted drills that were mandatory and punishable by fine if missed. All the towns had rules and regulations for night watches. Plymouth was training their men under Miles Standish, and Duxbury close by under William Holmes. As a matter of fact, these areas took preparation a step farther, Plymouth and Duxbury. To ensure all men were ready and able, it was required of all masters to provide servants with arms and ammunition upon completion of their indentured servitude. Massachusetts Bay had a much bigger population by this time than everybody else. They had more organization. They had 3 regiments that were overseen by 3 captains, Trask, Patrick, and Underhill. These guys were even paid. And John Endicott was the colonel. And the governor, whoever the governor might be at that time, was automatically recognized as the chief general. Lesser ranks were elected to their positions. So again, they had a pretty organized and pretty defined military unit. So on April 18th, Massachusetts Bay decided to take the fight to the Pequots. In addition to the 160 men, they passed an emergency tax to be levied to pay for the campaign. I'm thinking that's probably because of the failed mission of John Endicott the year earlier. You remember, they had told these guys that at that time were volunteers that their pay would be the booty they would get from the Niantics and the Pequots. That booty never materialized. The entire expedition was a failure. They also requested and expected help from Plymouth, and that would not be easy or quick to come by. You remember that Plymouth had had some developing interest in Connecticut themselves, and you remember also that they had actually approached the Massachusetts Bay magistrates to see if they'd like to go in on the investment together. And you remember Massachusetts Bay declined, only to settle the region themselves later, actually displacing the Plymouth folks at Windsor, one of their settlements. Plymouth blamed the magistrates for provoking the war. In fact, they had a list of grievances against Massachusetts Bay, a laundry list of reasons why they were not so eager to join the party. So on May 12th, the Plymouth grievances were delivered to Massachusetts Bay by Edward Winslow, and there were 4 officially that were recognized. The first one was that Massachusetts Bay had not helped Plymouth against the French in Maine. Now remember, they had had a couple of smaller outposts that they were struggling to get a foothold with. The Dutch had tried to help them with wampum. And we haven't really developed the French yet in our story, but we will. Secondly, Massachusetts Bay had molested Plymouth trade. They were, costing them commercial gain. And in a separate complaint from the general trade grievance, they complained that Massachusetts Bay did not recognize Plymouth's rights in Connecticut, which they hadn't. And fourthly, Plymouth was poorer than Massachusetts Bay and could really not afford the cost of a war. They didn't just record these grievances as if they were complaining. They wanted Massachusetts Bay to answer these charges. And they did, or somewhat. Governor Vane, whose days were literally numbered as he'd be gone by the end of the month, said the Massachusetts Bay call to arms was not just about Massachusetts Bay, but all the English colonies. He said the Pequots were a common enemy to everybody. He said the other native groups were watching. He really does not seem to have addressed the commercial grievances that Plymouth raised, or the issue of security that they raised, or the unilateral posturing that Massachusetts Bay was so good at. When John Winthrop was elected a few weeks later, he reached out to William Bradford and basically reiterated the same response as Vane had given. Bradford, like Winslow, didn't buy it. But eventually, Plymouth would come around to at least one point that Vane and Winthrop had raised. And that was that it was in the interest of the English, all the English, to deal with the Pequots, because all the other native groups were watching. They had to keep the Narragansetts from breaking their treaty, and that required a show of strength. The issue was not joint cooperation as much as security at this point. So they assigned a few dozen guys. I mean, depending on what records you're reading, what book you're reading, somewhere between 30 and 50 men for fighting, under the command of Lieutenant Holmes, and a crew to man a vessel. Because of their delayed response, they missed the massacre at Mystic altogether. After the fact, William Hubbard recorded that the Pilgrims' missed action was, quote, not to be imputed to any backwardness in their minds, but to their late invitation to the service, end quote. That's not exactly what they said, but okay, William Hubbard recorded that they just had been asked too late to actually get involved. But Boston's delay was longer, like 9 months longer. Not all of Massachusetts Bay. If you'll notice a few times already this episode, I've made that distinction. Boston and Massachusetts Bay. The delay was not on the part of Massachusetts Bay, but really just Boston. They had bigger issues than Plymouth. Theirs were internal. Again, if you remember, the Antinomian controversy was literally tearing them apart. Stephen Wheelwright had not yet been banished. You remember, he would eventually flee to New Hampshire. He was another defender of Anne Hutchinson. Well, when the votes were cast for governor just a few weeks from this point in time, Boston had favored Vane. It was the outlying communities, the more conservative guys, that had elected Winthrop. So if we look at it like in modern elections, Vane's like the liberal guy getting the urban vote, and Winthrop was like the conservative guy getting the rural vote. So anyways, Stephen Wheelwright had a lot to do with that. He had convinced most of Boston that John Winthrop was an enemy of Christ. So Boston, in the heat of that battle, only managed to send a few undesirable men for battle. And we think that politics is dirty today. We think that this is something new. We think that this is the first generation, or there's only been a couple of generations where political views differed so greatly in our society, where they really didn't exact a lot of change, where there really wasn't a consequence or a repercussion. Anytime you have a society, especially one that's in growth mode, that's got a lot of lockstep, concepts, and, whether it's political or religious or philosophical, anytime you have that type of a culture, you're bound to get somebody rubbed wrong. You're bound to get controversy. And that's what was happening. So anyways, Massachusetts Bay had another reason for their delay. It was a colony-wide reason. You see, before 1634, they had hired professional military men, like all of the colonies had done, to organize their defenses. But when Ferdinando Gorges and John Mason, the elder, remember the governor of New Hampshire, had begun the legal actions against the Bay Charter, they moved the responsibility of the military to the magistrates. That way, nobody was coming over and being beholden to England, right? They formed an all-powerful military council headed by the governor, and its powers included capital punishment. Alfred Cave put it this way, quote, in response to the Pequot crisis, the magistrates reorganized the train bands into 3 regiments, representing Suffolk, Middlesex, and Essex counties. The leaders of those regiments received the rank of colonel, but in making those appointments, the War Council bypassed the professional soldiers who had led the train bands. The new commanding officers were magistrates, men of weight and orthodoxy who could be trusted to uphold the Puritan order. From Suffolk County, John Winthrop was appointed colonel. Thomas Dudley was designated lieutenant colonel. Middlesex's military forces were entrusted to Colonel John Haynes and Lieutenant Colonel Roger Harlekenden. John Endicott commanded the Essex County force, assisted by John Winthrop Jr. With the exception of Endicott and Dudley, none of these new officers had any prior military experience whatsoever. With the exception of Endicott, none led Massachusetts Bay Volunteers against the Pequots, but they retained their commands for political reasons, while those who did the actual fighting had to settle for lesser rank. Several of the professional soldiers who might reasonably have expected their own commands, John Underhill, William Trask, Daniel Patrick, for example, received the rank of muster master and were placed under the close supervision of the magistrate commanders. Needless to say, the command situation produced tensions and resentments. John Underhill complained bitterly that if professional officers were, quote, of no better esteem than constables, he would rather lay down my command, end quote. Underhill, of course, rendered the Bay Colony notable service throughout the Pequot War. However, his open sympathy for Anne Hutchinson, exiled in 1637, resulted in the termination of his career in Massachusetts. When Underhill returned to Boston at the war's end, he was disarmed and disenfranchised. A land grant promised in compensation for his military service was withheld, and Underhill was subsequently exiled. In justification of that action, Winthrop noted that Underhill had claimed to have received direct inspiration from God while, quote, taking the moderate use of the creature called tobacco, end quote. He had also allegedly committed, quote, incontinency with a neighbor's wife, end quote. And again, we've covered this in our 4 or 5 part series on John Underhill. A woman, quote, young and beautiful and withal of a jovial spirit and behavior, end quote. Underhill claimed that he was simply offering the woman spiritual comfort, quote, and that when the door was found locked upon them, they were in private prayer together, end quote. So that definitely reads like a dime store novel or a soap opera, doesn't it? You know, pick your poison. Politicians sticking their fingers in military affairs that they don't understand and don't belong, taking guys, experts in their field, at this point, military officers with experience, and giving them lesser roles so that the good old boys club can survive. You've got a little bit of adultery. You've got the antinomian controversy where societies are really split on certain things. I mean, all of this is going on in a very short time frame. So Massachusetts Bay was reeling from the antinomian controversy, and John Underhill paid the price militarily. He paid the price from getting his due pay and reward for service, and ultimately was forced to leave the colony. So again, from this quote and the mention of the antinomian controversy and Fernando Gorges and John Mason, you can begin to see some of the rationale, I hope, behind the previous episodes as we've built to this point. The Anne Hutchinson episodes and the small series on John Mason a few months back correspond very nicely right here. It would have been too much to juggle, though, had we done everything, right now. I mean, we would have lost sight of some of these things. It's better to isolate them. And again, it's that concept of the transparencies. But if you haven't heard those episodes, I mean, maybe you haven't listened that long, you've only tuned in a couple of times, they may be worthwhile now. Suffice it to say, Massachusetts Bay almost ceased to exist except for the untimely and premature death of John Mason in 1635. He was en route to the Bay from England with legal documents to challenge their charter and organization. And if you remember, he worked very closely with Fernando Gorges, who was an anti-Puritan. His goal was to establish an Anglican stronghold. Unless we underestimate the influence and the authority and the importance of these two guys, because they've been largely written out of the American storyline, they were extremely well connected. And Gorges basically controlled the northeastern coast of North America, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Maine, New Hampshire. He played an integral role in allowing Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay to get started. And John Mason was a national hero several times over. So I really hope this all makes sense and ties together for those that have been listening for a while. It's not just fascinating. Well, I find it fascinating, but it really paints quite a different picture of what was going on in colonial times in New England, quite a different picture than we're used to seeing. I mean, life was moving really fast for these guys, and there was no patience for dissent. So 2 of the 3 English areas are down. We've talked about Plymouth. We talked about Massachusetts Bay. Let's take a look at what was happening in Connecticut. Like the other colonies, they had compulsory military service and regular drills. They had been taking a very defensive posture since the previous summer, but that all ended on May 16th. the Connecticut General Assembly, comprised of 2 magistrates and 3 commissioners from each of the 3 Massachusetts Bay transplanted towns. I mean, these guys had just recently come from Massachusetts Bay to start new lives. They were organized, but they were still Massachusetts people in Boston's eyes. I mean, you see the coming tension, right? These guys moved away from Massachusetts Bay. They moved away from the influence of Boston to kind of do their own thing, and they really felt like it was a little too constraining in Boston. So they believe that they've left that colony. But Massachusetts Bay, the magistrates and the power brokers in Boston, they still saw these guys as kind of like their people. That's coming after the Pequot War. Who was going to be in charge of the Connecticut region? So at any rate, this Connecticut General Assembly, acting on their own, declared war on the Pequots and raised an army of 90 men. I mean, that's actually quite an investment for them. The whole area only had about 250 Englishmen at this point. They may have moved on this after Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, but they did finally get the message. And if their organization tells us anything, it tells us that they understood the scope of what lay ahead. They acted with a sense of urgency. John Hooker had warned the court, quote, not to do this work of the Lord's revenge slackly, end quote. So we see another instance here where the English considered this to be much like a holy war, like they had experienced across Europe. So they put Captain John Mason of Windsor in charge. Now, again, he's not Governor Mason of New Hampshire fame, the guy that died en route to Massachusetts Bay. This is another John Mason of Windsor, and he was a veteran of the wars in Europe, like so many of his counterparts. His second in command was Lieutenant Robert Seeley. So we have the sense of urgency and we have the leadership. Here's how they planned to provide for these men. In the first place, the breakdown of conscripted men was as follows. Hartford would contribute 42 men, and Windsor 30, and Wethersfield 18, based on population. For provisions, they actually called up quite a bit of these provisions, and they got this together pretty quick. For provisions, they called for the supply of armor for 20 men. Each of these settlements was given, a dictate of what they were supposed to provide. So Hartford would provide 84 bushels of corn, 3 firkins of suet, and 2 firkins of butter. Firkin, F-I-R-K-I-N. Firkins. I had to look that up. Just to get an idea of how much we're talking, 1 firkin was equivalent to about 41 liters. So they wanted 3 firkins of suet, or 120, 121, 22, 23 liters of suet, and 2 firkins of butter. So roughly 82 liters of butter. 4 bushels of oatmeal, 2 bushels of both peas and salt, 500 fish. Wethersfield was to add 36 bushels of corn and a bushel of Indian beans. And Windsor's contribution would be 50 bushels of corn, 50 pieces of pork, 30 pounds of rice, and 4 cheeses. And the question I have on that is, what do they mean by a piece of pork or 4 cheeses? I can only imagine if we're talking about firkins in the 41 liter area, we're talking about a couple of hundred bushels of corn at this point. But there was also supposed to be beer, 1 hogshead of good beer for the captain and master and sick men. And I wonder what they meant by good beer. They were saying, don't send Milwaukee's best? I don't know. Sorry for those of you out there that like Milwaukee's best. I'm really sorry for you, actually. 1 bottle of strong liquor also. How strong, you might ask? As one who was there put it, quote, when it was empty, the bottle, the very smelling to the bottle would presently recover such as fainted away, end quote. That's got to be like moonshine. But also, each man had his own responsibilities and his own supplies to gather for himself. He was required to have 1 pound of powder, 4 pounds of shot, 20 bullets, and a musket. And they would each receive a barrel of powder at Saybrook once they got there. The goal was that they would travel by shallop, sailing down the river on the trader William Pynchon's vessel. You see how you keep hearing these same names coming up. And part of that, I think, is because there really weren't that many guys there, right? So William Pynchon, we talked about him a few times. He was going to supply the vessels. So the stage was set. The colonies of Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, along with Saybrook Fort and the Connecticut settlements and their Narragansett Niantic allies against the Pequots and the few friends that they had left, like Sequin and his Wangunks. But there was one more name, one more group to be added to this. So let's back up. Before they departed from Hartford, the Connecticut men attended a church service where they were exhorted and encouraged to, quote, execute those whom God, the righteous judge of all the world, hath condemned for blaspheming his sacred majesty and murdering his servants, end quote. They were also told, quote, to execute vengeance on the heathen, bind their kings in chains and nobles in fetters of iron, make their multitudes fall under your warlike weapons, your feet shall set upon their proud necks, end quote. So they were sent on their way a month before Massachusetts Bay had said they wanted to engage. The initial visit to Saybrook by John Mason and his 7 had turned into a much larger and more determined bunch. And so again, it was at this point, after the church service, after the supplies had been gathered, after the shallops had been gathered, after they're ready to go, after all of the preparations had been made, and that happened pretty quick. I mean, it only took them 10 days from the commission of this party to its launch. As they were leaving, a native leader showed up and asked to join the English, and he was Uncas, the Mohegan Sachem that had recently split from the Pequots. He had started with 30 men, but had more than doubled his number as he walked with volunteers from the other river tribes, happy to fight the Pequots. He arrived at Hartford with about 70 warriors. And he would join the English, and he and John Mason would form a lifelong bond, friendship and business. But first, there was a battle to be fought, a people to be vanquished, a war to be won. So off they went. Now, I do want to say, too, we're going to talk a little bit about Uncas in our next episode, but he's going to be showing up pretty regularly for quite a while. He probably was one of the most influential of the natives, certainly for the English. He played the role of almost like a Massasoit on steroids, although, in my opinion, Massasoit probably was a little more honest. But Uncas knew how to play the political game very well. He's an interesting character. He accomplished a lot for his people. And when we look at history through that lens through the perspective of the folks that were there, he actually was quite a leader for the people that followed him. And, I have a lot of respect for him, historically speaking, but we're going to find some of the things that he does pretty interesting. He was pretty good at watching out for himself and ingratiating himself to the power brokers, and that was the English. So at any rate, Uncas joins the group, and off they went. They're sailing down the river until the shallops could move no more due to low water. The travel was very slow. So Uncas and his warriors went on ahead by foot. And that caused a little bit of anxiety because nobody really knew at this point if Uncas could be trusted. I mean, there were no cell phones back then. There was no way to communicate to Saybrook what was going on, right? So he would, frankly, arrive at Saybrook with a sizable group and just kind of announce his allegiance. I mean, how would you like that? If you were John Mason right now, wouldn't you be a little leery that you may have just set Saybrook up? That maybe this was all just a ploy and a ruse? I mean, what if you were Lion Gardner or John Underhill waiting at Saybrook and you see these guys come out? I mean, that's a pretty good sized force. This could be a recipe for disaster all the way around because maybe Uncas wasn't up to no good. And as it turns out, he wasn't. But how would John Underhill or Lion Gardner have known that? What if they would have fired on this group? Maybe, you fire first, ask questions later. Anyways, Uncas knew the game that he was playing. And like I said before, and like we'll see in subsequent episodes, Uncas played the game well. As the Mohegans were making their way to Saybrook, they came across 7 Pequots. They promptly killed them, scalped them, and then presented those scalps to the folks at Saybrook when they arrived. Now, this was a sizable war party, and so there was a lot of celebration, especially with the scalps. I mean, people were probably pretty happy to see them. You can imagine being some of the guys that had spent all winter at Saybrook and suddenly seeing, Mason showed up a few weeks ago and then he left, but then seeing Underhill show up with 20 more guys, and now all of a sudden you've got all of these native warriors coming. I mean, you've got to be feeling pretty good. But that was not enough to convince Lion Gardner of Uncas's loyalty and his friendship. So at this point, understandably, all the natives were suspect. But these guys were harder than most to trust. I mean, they were more suspect because of their long history of union with the Pequots. And again, we're going to look at that aspect a little closer in our next episode. But these guys were basically either one in the same tribe as the Pequots, depending on, your take on it and who you read and what your mindset is. But more than likely, the Mohegans and the Pequots had a very close union, but they did remain separate and distinct. But up until very recently here, the Mohegans were definitely a part of the Pequots. So all of a sudden, you got this guy coming around with a host of warriors, and he wants to help you fight the Pequots. That would be a hard pill to swallow. So Lion Gardner, in all of his wisdom, needed proof of Uncas's loyalty, and he gave him an assignment to prove if he was going to be loyal or not. He told Uncas that there was a small band of 6 Pequots at nearby Bass River. The task was to go and retrieve them. He told Uncas to bring them back to Saybrook, dead or alive. And then Gardner would be convinced of his friendship. So Uncas took 20 men and left for Bass River. And I think that was shrewd in and of itself, wasn't it? He left most of his guys behind. So anyways, that would be a sign that he trusts these guys at Saybrook. That would be my take. Like maybe he's calculating that splitting up his group makes him look a little more vulnerable. I don't know. But at any rate, he went and he found those Pequots at Bass River, and he killed 4 of them and captured 1. 1 did get away. So when he returned to Saybrook, he gave the 4 men that he had killed, he gave their heads to Gardner as a gift, and also the prisoner. And the prisoner was known at Saybrook. He had spent time there and was also a known spy for Sassacus. He spoke English well. As his fate was now in Gardner's hands, he hissed, quote, that they durst not kill a Pequot, end quote. Now, I'm sure in times past, that threat may have had some weight behind it. But at this point, dude, we're going to war. The idea that you're a Pequot, we should leave you alone, has no bearing whatsoever. Nothing. This guy's name was Kiswas. And as they interrogated him, he admitted to being a part of the raiding parties and killing Englishmen. And for this, he received the death sentence. Gardner explained that he would not just die, but that he would be tortured like his English victims had been. Kiswas was unmoved. He said that he was a Pequot and he knew how to die. So the task for capital punishment was actually given to the Mohegans. I mean, after all, they'd brought him in. But I wonder too sometimes if this was also another test on Gardner's part. I mean, it does sound plausible. Maybe it was just as simple as you guys, you brought him in, you get the glory of killing him. But I do wonder if Gardner was looking at this as one more test for loyalty. Anyways, his death was messy. Leo Bonfanti relayed that they had tied one of his legs to a post and tied a long rope to the other. And the 20 men who had been a part of the arresting party all grabbed the rope and they tore him in 2. Think about that for a minute. Think about how hard that would be to tear that flesh. Think about the mess that would make. I mean, does it just take the leg off? Does it rip you up the body? I mean, I'm not sure how that would work, but that had to hurt. And again, it was messy. It had to have taken a huge effort from those men. It seems like it to me. There's 20 of them, maybe not. I don't know. But that's gross. He didn't even die from being torn in 2. He actually was put out of his misery by John Underhill, who frankly walked up and shot him. Then the Mohegans roasted his body. And depending on who you read, they either ate him, or a large chunk of him, or they simply cut off a piece of him and they each shared a bite. At any rate, the Mohegans ingested the dead Pequot. This was an event that was recorded in the memoirs of Lion Gardner and John Mason and John Underhill and others. It was a unique set of circumstances here. Confirmation for all, right? I mean, John Underhill recorded that as he approached the shallops commanded by John Mason earlier on, he heard the Reverend Samuel Stone, the expedition's chaplain, praying for the Lord to, quote, manifest one pledge of thy love that may confirm us the fidelity of these Indians toward us, end quote. So there was trepidation. The English were trying to figure out if Uncas was really going to be their friend or not. So all of these circumstances, all of these situations kind of came together. On the way down to Saybrook, Uncas came across the Pequots. Once he got to Saybrook, he went out and got another band of Pequots, and then they tore this poor Kiswas in 2. So as far as the English were concerned, as far as probably the Reverend Samuel Stone was concerned, as far as the men in the John Mason expedition were concerned, that was the Lord manifesting that pledge of his love, that he confirmed to them the fidelity of those Indians. So the Uncas fidelity was proved sufficiently enough, and there were now a sufficient number of men at Saybrook. So you've got, all of the guys coming down, the 90 from the Connecticut settlements. You've got the 70 that came with Uncas. You've got the 20 with Underhill. And so Lyon Gardner and the English leadership were now in a position to actually call the shots and enforce them. So they closed the trade in Connecticut to the Dutch. Well, they closed it to everybody. But outside of the English, it was mostly the Dutch they're stopping. Because even in the middle of all of this that's going on, commercial activity continued, as it always does in virtually every culture throughout human history. Even if they did not trade directly with the Pequots, it was figured, or if they only traded commodities, it could still help the enemy. They could melt the iron or the metalworks down and make arrowheads. Arrowheads, they figured, that would be used against the English. So they stopped all of the traders from going upriver, except one, a Dutchman. He had argued to let him go and retrieve the girls from Weathersfield that had been taken hostage. Finally, Gardner agreed to let him go up the river on the promise that he would ransom the two girls. Gardner actually paid the guy 10 pounds out of his own pocket. I know that because later on he would complain that he was never actually reimbursed. It would appear that they did know the difference between English and Dutch, the Pequots I'm saying. You remember, the Pequots have said, oh, we don't know the difference between you Englishmen, and the English have said, oh, we don't know the difference between you natives. But they must have known the difference, or they knew this Dutch guy personally, because when he arrived at the village, they received him and they were ready to trade. He said he wanted the girls. He didn't want wampum, and he didn't want fur that time. He wanted the girls. That's a pretty ballsy move. I mean, think about what's been going on here in Connecticut. He must have anticipated a huge payday of some kind. I mean, this was a risk, right? But we've talked about this the last few weeks with like John Tilley. I mean, entrepreneurs are willing to take risk that most of us are not willing to take. And that's why, instead of being jealous or coveting what a rich guy has, most of the guys that I know that are wealthy have worked a lot harder or a lot longer and a lot smarter and taken much greater risk than most of the other guys that I know. This is a perfect example. This guy must have anticipated a huge payday to have taken this kind of a risk. At any rate, they didn't kill him, but Sassacus refused to part with the girls. He knew that they had value. They were negotiation capital against the English. They were kind of an insurance policy for him. And actually, it was later reported by the girls themselves that they were supposed to have been killed, but Sassacus's wife, Wincombone, had convinced him to spare their lives. Maybe she convinced him of their greater potential value. I mean, maybe she's the one that said, look, you can use these guys as insurance. Maybe she was just merciful towards them. Maybe she thought they'd become Pequots, right? Just absorbed into the community, like the Morning Wars would do. They could become Pequots and make Pequot babies that would grow up to be Pequot warriors or other women and make more Pequot babies. I don't know. It's also thought that he was hoping that they would be able to make gunpowder, and that they couldn't do. So in the end, they really didn't offer quite the benefit that Sassacus had hoped. Remember, he had 16 guns. That's not a lot, but it's something. But if you can't produce the ammunition and the powder, the guns aren't going to mean a whole lot. So anyways, the Dutch trader was not going to take no for an answer. So, like a typical European dealing with these natives, he hatched a plan. I mean, it always works this way, right? It seems like every time the Europeans go out to hunt, they get killed. And it seems like every time there's a problem with the trader, the natives get kidnapped, right? So he comes up with this plan. He invited 7 Pequot sachems aboard his vessel. And once on board, he took them hostage. And he used their lives for leverage. Kind of like Sassacus might have been planning to do with the girls. But Sassacus still refused to give him the girls. So the Dutchman raised his sails and he started to leave. He headed for open waters. Sassacus had a change of heart. He sent men to chase after the Dutch ship and agreed to trade the girls for the sachems. I mean, at the end of the day, maybe he just, wanted his sachems back. Maybe he was just being brotherly towards those of his own tribe. Maybe he said these 7 sachems, not only are they 7 more men for war, but I don't know how many men those guys controlled. But so maybe Sassacus this is a political move, right? I mean, maybe he's trying to appease those that are still within his group. So with that, the Dutch trader collected the girls, but he didn't go straight to Saybrook. Because Arthur Cave adds an interesting piece to this story. One more angle to the saga that's, I think, again, quite interesting. And it might shed light on why the trader went to such lengths, such dangerous lengths, to free these girls. Maybe it sheds light on the kind of payday that he might have thought he was going to get. Apparently, Before he had left to rescue the girls, the Dutch Director General of New Netherland, Van Twiller, we've talked about him before, he heard about the traders' deal with Lion Gardner, and he sent another vessel to catch up with the first vessel and relayed the message that the trader was to get the girls by peaceable means if possible, but force if necessary. So you wonder what Van Twiller's angle was. You wonder what deal was hatched with this trader, but you wonder what his angle was. Was he just trying to figure out the mood of the Pequots? Was he trying to spy on the English? I don't know. But the one request from the director was that he would be able to interview the girls first. When the girls were brought down to Saybrook, the Dutch trader stopped by pretty quick and basically said to Lion Gardner, look at Van Twiller over there, he wants to meet with these girls before you interview them. Is that okay? Gardner was fine with that. I mean, what would it matter, frankly? Either the girls would have been dead or the Dutch would get them back. The English wouldn't have been able to do anything anyways. So with the girls safely in the care of the Dutch, they answered the questions of the Director General Van Twiller in New Netherlands. I don't know what those questions were. And then they were taken to Saybrook and met with the English leaders. Both John Mason and John Underhill interrogated them and asked them questions. It's interesting, though, they asked different questions. Like Mason asked about the Pequots themselves. Underhill asked about their care, how they had been treated. It's interesting to know that that was the line of questioning Underhill took, knowing how rough a man that he was. Remember when we did our series on him, this guy is nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. He's an absolute butcher. But at any rate, what Mason learned was that the Pequots had 16 muskets, powder, and ammunition, and he was able to learn about their village and their setup as well. The Underhill notes from this experience are curious to me. He focused on them, the girls, the spiritual side of the ordeal and how they had been treated. And again, he's such a tough guy that it's like a little surprising to me that he was concerned about that. Maybe he was looking for motivation or a reason to kill the Pequots. He was looking to psych himself up. Maybe he was thinking of his own family at this point. I don't know. But he recorded in part, and if you'll forgive me, I'm going to quote one more time from Alfred A. Cave, The Pequot War. It's a great book. I've quoted from him quite a bit. And he seems to have done a great job of really capturing the essence of what was going on in so many of these passages. So at any rate, from Alfred A. Cave, Underhill recorded this, quote, "The oldest of them was about 16 years of age. Demanding of her how they had used her, she told us that they did solicit her to uncleanness, but her heart being much broken and afflicted under the bondage she was cast in, had brought to her consideration these thoughts. How shall I commit this great evil and sin against my God? Their hearts were much taken up with the consideration of God's just displeasure to them." End quote. Underhill noted approvingly that the girls regarded their captivity as a sign of God's displeasure, realizing that God's hand was justly upon them for their remissness in all of their ways. Their release, they believed, was a sure sign of God's grace. End quote. Well, that's a great way of looking at it, isn't it? Underhill was pleased that the girls thought that they had done something to deserve that. Maybe they had, I don't know. But I don't think that God is as capricious and vindictive as we think that he is. At any rate, another thing that struck me about the differences in the line of questioning between Mason and Underhill was that their approaches also seemed to mirror the respective attitude of their colonies and regions that they're representing. Maybe I'm looking too much into this, but I can just see this playing out this way, right? I mean, Mason was representing Connecticut in a time of real existential threat, clear and present danger. He needed to make sure that he had every advantage afforded to him because all of the people he held dear in his own home and his own town were all threatened, right? I mean, the Pequots are there. Underhill was representing Massachusetts Bay and the pride of Puritanism. His line of questioning was right in line with what they would have naturally focused on, especially since the clear and present danger facing Connecticut was not being felt by Massachusetts Bay. I mean, they were geographically quite a ways removed from this. Their interests, no matter the arguments or protestations, were financial. Their grave danger was more in the pocketbook than the body. So, with this episode over, they could focus on the offensive war that they were soon to wage against the Pequots. They had a lot more men now. They were a lot more secure in many ways, but the Pequots still vastly outnumbered them and had concentrated their forces. Attacking them head-on would not be a wise idea. A plan was hatched to avoid attacking them straight from the river in a frontal assault. It would take some maneuvering and some slight deviation from their orders, but the plan they devised just might work. I mean, it had to, or they very well may pay the ultimate price. But that's a plan to consider for another day. We'll work through the plan and the execution on that day. But for today, I hope our time together has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.